Look at what was going on in Black America prior to the 1960s in terms of Black education advancement, Blacks entering the skilled professions, Black home ownership rates, Black-white income gaps were shrinking. Then we get the 1960s,
right.
And the shift, there's a shift to acquiring political capital, integrating political institutions. The Voting Rights Act comes along, and it was a tremendous success. You had voter registration rates in 1964 in the South, places like Georgia, Alabama, single digits, Black voter registration rates. A year after the Civil Rights Act, they're up to the 50%, 60%. I mean, it was a tremendous success.
Right.
It worked. And then the leadership, the Black leadership in particular, turned to focus on electing more Black officials. And the thinking was, if we could elect more Black officials, the rest will take care of itself. Black socioeconomic advancement will flow naturally from Black political clout. We just need to get more of our kind into office, and the rest will take care of itself.
50 years ago, when the civil rights movement morphed into a race grievance industry. And this came at the advent of the poverty programs, where many of the civil rights leaders became elected public democratic officials at a time when poverty programs was dispensing $22 trillion. So they had an opportunity. So you got now a poverty industry that was born.
Black political office holders have proliferated in this country. Between 1970 and 2010, they went from fewer than 1,500 to more than 10,000, including Black mayors, Black governors, Black congressmen, Black school superintendents, Black police chiefs and fire chiefs, Blacks, and in large cities with large Black populations, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, Atlanta. So Blacks gained a tremendous amount of political clout with this strategy. The problem is that the rest didn't happen the way it was supposed to. In other words, if you look at what happened in Marion Barry's Washington, D.C., or Sharp James's Newark, or Coleman Young's Detroit, the Black poor became more impoverished on their watch. Which is not to say that there's a causal link here, that because there were Black mayors, we didn't see Black advancement, because this Black advancement didn't occur under white mayors and white governors and white congressmen too.
The political power has not been translated into the things that Blacks need, like better schools, more safer communities. You know, some of the cities in our country whose mayors and city councilmen are predominantly Black, they're some of our cities with the major problems. Now, I personally don't think that political power in and of itself is a solution to the problems.
All the incentives politically are for Black leaders to blame all problems in the Black community on the larger society. And that enables them to take on the role of being the defender of the Black community against enemies.
Since 70 cents of every dollar spent on poverty in the last 50 years went not to the poor, but those who serve poor people. They ask which problems are not solvable, but which ones are fundable.
Politicians have their own agenda, and it's not always going to be the agenda that the Black poor in this case need in particular. And I'll give you an example with President Obama. Take education. As you know, school choice is tremendously popular in the Black community, particularly among low-income Blacks. They're for charters, they're for vouchers at much higher rates than whites. Obama becomes President of the United States and spends 8 years trying to shut down a school voucher program in his own backyard in Washington, D.C. that was started by his predecessor, George W. Bush. Why? Why? The first Black president could enhance this program that he knows, poll after poll shows, is popular in the Black community. The reason is that Barack Obama is no longer simply another Black person. He's now a Black president. He has special interests that are nipping at his heels. He wants to be reelected. He has to indulge these special interests, one of whom are teachers' unions, who oppose school choice because many of these schools aren't unionized and don't use union labor. So Obama has a choice. Am I going to side with my political benefactors, or am I going to side with this black constituency that helped put me in office? He made his choice. He sided with the teachers' unions.
Once these black politicians became the dispenser of those funds, the poor became a commodity. And so what you're seeing over the last 50 years, the deterioration of those core inner cities that have been run by liberal Democratic congressmen and officials. And so in order to justify, they don't have to answer the question, why are poor blacks failing in systems run by their own people? And the only way they can escape having to answer that question is to advance the notion that racism, institutional racism, is at play here.
And that's what you're going to see because politicians want to get reelected. And when their interests part ways with those of the people they claim to represent, they're gonna put their own interests first, because that's what politicians do. And that is the problem for low-income blacks looking to politicians to be their savior. It's not going to happen.
Black leadership today is pretty much nothing left but hustlers who work white guilt.
What we want are for blacks to be in a position to thrive no matter who's in office.
Let me play you a brief excerpt of Donald Trump himself. This is from the State of the Union address this past January.
This will be my first time to hear
It's
it.
something I'm very proud of. African American unemployment stands at the lowest rate ever recorded.
Okay.
Oh my.
He produces a maybe the statistic isn't quite right. There maybe
No, it is. It is.
It is.
Yes.
And there you see a shot. You see Republicans standing and applauding, and there you see a shot of Democrats who are sitting on their hands, including many members of the Black Caucus.
Yes.
In Congress. What do you make of that?
That, as with so many other groups around the world, the leaders of groups that are lagging are often themselves one of the biggest handicaps of those groups, because they have to depict the problems in ways that will allow them to play the role of rescuers. And so there'll be no talk about how you can do this or that for yourself. There'll be talk about what we can get the government to deliver for you.
The idea that black political clout would lead to more black economic advancement was misplaced.
The Obama administration's racial politics almost certainly harmed racial discourse. By 2016, polls showed race relations had reached their lowest point in nearly a quarter of a century. Huge achievement. Almost everyone would argue, I think, to elect a black man president of the United States, and 8 years later, somehow, Jason contends, race relations are worse, not better. What happened?
Well, President Obama is a politician, first and foremost, and he is a liberal politician who ascribes to identity politics, like many others in his party do. In fact, it's probably been worse today than it was when he was in office, this adherence to identity politics. And that is appealing to various voting blocs, telling them to vote for politicians who look like them, who share their racial or ethnic background. That is a priority when it comes to who you should choose to represent you politically. Appealing to blacks as blacks, women as women, gay people as gay people, not appealing to them as Americans with a common interest. That is identity politics, and that is something that President Obama practiced. And it is a very divisive strategy. It helps you get out your base. It may help you scare people to the polls, rile up voters that you need to support you, but at the end of the day, you end up with a very polarized electorate. And that is what President Obama practiced.
Obama's presidency hasn't meant very much for the black community. I don't see any big change. I don't see lower crime rates. I don't see greater high school graduation rates. But in general, I don't think that there is much progress that blacks can make through the political arena. And
Now, what do you mean by that?
You look at our country and you ask the question, In what cities do blacks have the highest crime, suffer from the highest victimization rates from crime, the rottenest schools, the very, very poor living conditions? They are in the very cities where a black is the mayor, a black is chief of police, a black is the superintendent of schools. Now, I'm not stating a causal relationship, but I'm saying that if political power meant so much, you would expect, let's in a city like Philadelphia, where a black is the mayor, a black is superintendent of school, black chief of police, you'd expect every living conditions to be wonderful.
They say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. This might be that road. It's covered thick with good intentions. In the mid-1960s and throughout the 70s and early 80s, federal and state governments poured immense energy and well over $1 trillion into the task of relieving poverty and promoting equality. The result, a complete failure. For many blacks at the lower end of the economic spectrum, the future looks more hopeless today than it did 20 years ago.
As of 1960, 2/3 of all black American children were living with both parents. That declined over the years until only 1/3 were living with both parents in 1995. Among black families in poverty, 85% of the children had no father present. Close quote. So it's not the legacy of slavery that destroys the African American family.
It's the legacy of the welfare state.
And why does the welfare state dissolve the family structure?
For one thing, it makes it unnecessary for fathers to support their offspring, and in fact, it makes it counterproductive in many cases. A very poor man who might be able to support his family realizes his family will be better off without him.
Lyndon Johnson sent people knocking on doors. I lived in the 60s, and people knocked on doors apprising women of their availability to welfare, provided there was no man in the house. And we went from 25% of blacks being born outside of wedlock in 65 to 75% right now.
95% of the men in our federal prison system have no relationship with their dad.
If you look at the breakdown the black family, and matter of fact, maybe breakdown is a poor term to use. The black family does not form in the first place.
You're creating a situation where if the man stays there, the government will not give the woman welfare, and if he leaves, it will. And so they're paying. When you pay people not to get married, more people don't get married.
1890, 1900, you look at census reports. A black kid, believe it or not, was slightly more likely to be born to a nuclear intact family than a white kid. Even during slavery, a black kid was more likely to be born under a roof with his biological mother and biological father than today. What's happened is we launched this so-called war on poverty in the 60s.
I know firsthand about welfare dependency because of my own life living 7 years in and out. In the 60s, when they started this social engineering, black family life was relatively intact. 22% out of wedlock birth rates. Today, 72%. They collapsed the family.
I came from a broken home, but in my day that was unusual. Black families were almost as stable as white families. The black family did not start falling apart until the 1960s, as more blacks were lured into the welfare culture.
In the black community up until 1960s, there was a stigma associated with being on relief.
The illegitimacy rate among blacks is somewhere around 70%. And back in the 40s, it couldn't have been more than 13, 12%, something like that. Or the breakdown in the black family, only 35% of kids, black kids live in two-parent families. And matter of fact, when we were coming up, my father deserted us when I was 3 and my sister was 2, and they ultimately got divorced in the late 40s. But among our friends, we were the only kids in the Richard Allen housing project that did not have a mother and father in the house, and today would be exactly the opposite. It would be rare to have a mother and father in the household today.
Someone who's strictly irresponsible, either the man or the woman or both, now pays no price for being irresponsible. The taxpayers pay the price, and actually the harm done to the taxpayers, which is serious, still is not comparable to the harm done to the families, especially the children.
To the kids.
Yeah.
The LA Times had a poll where both poor people and non-poor people were asked the following question: do young poor women often have children to get welfare benefits? Not too surprisingly, the majority of non-poor people said no. 44% said that young poor women often have children to get welfare benefits. Most did not believe that. Poor people were asked the same question: do you believe that young poor women often have children to get welfare benefits? 64% said often. So they're telling us, we're just not listening.
Like some giant drug pusher, their government has lured them into dependency on a system that will maintain them in permanent poverty.
Back when I was coming up, that is, for a girl to have a baby out of wedlock, it was a disgrace. Today, women have babies out of wedlock and they have baby showers. It's no longer a disgrace.
Children raised without two parents present. That was about 22% in 1960. One generation later, it was 67%, and it's gone up a little since then as well. And now the rate among whites is higher than it was among blacks in 1960. Right. So if you look at what actually happens in the wake of these wonderful sounding policies, you see disaster after disaster.
Prior to the 1960s, pathology was never associated with poverty. People who were sharecroppers and robbed folks or robbed banks to do things like that, poverty was never associated with aberrant behavior. What happened was in the 1960s, and the out-of-wedlock births occurred starting in the 60s with the poverty programs in the welfare state. The welfare state became an invading army into the black community.
This whole notion that we should even have a war on poverty dismisses the fact that individuals have a role in their own lives.
Well, there are actually books with titles and subtitles about the origins of poverty. Well, the entire human species began in poverty. So I don't know how we're going to say, what is the origin of this, perhaps in the Garden of Eden or someplace. There's no explanation needed for poverty. The species began in poverty. So what you really need to know is what are the things that enable some countries, some groups within countries, to become prosperous.
We have accepted this narrative that what we see today in Black America is a result of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. And what I argue in the book is that what we see today is the legacy of the Great Society, of the legacy of 60s programs that were well-intentioned, trying to help low-income blacks in particular, but had unintended consequences. And today we see the consequences that those policies engendered.
The very people who want this war on poverty are the ones standing in the way of parents having choice in education.
The federal government now takes 25% of the American economy, forcing the public square to become a battleground of constant conflict.
70 cents of every dollar for the last 50 years of the 22 trillion spent on poverty went not to the poor, but those who serve poor people.
Means-tested federal welfare programs alone are $900 billion annually, a quarter of our national budget.
When you think about the civil rights movement, it was a movement to remove governmental barriers. Jim Crow was a governmental barrier. Remove these barriers so that we can educate, so that we can attain economic success. Rather than us continue on that journey to say, okay, we've removed these barriers, now go live free. Many that took up the mantle after Dr. King's death went to Washington and politicized the movement. And so you started seeing the interest of the community move toward government intervention. When you think about government intervention, not only did the welfare class start to unravel that entire community, the working class started to become addicted to government. Today, the government is the #1 employer of black men and the second largest employer of black women. This should not occur in a free society.
You see, you can't have a welfare state in a democratic country unless you first have a welfare state vision. And when you buy all the assumptions of that vision, then you're buying a lot of trouble.
In 1960, 20% of Americans got more from government than they put in. Today, 60% of Americans get more from government than they put in.
I think any economist would tell you that if you tax something, you're going to get less of it. And if you subsidize something, you're going to get more of it, whether it's wheat, cheese, or slovenly behavior. And indeed, in the United States, we have been subsidizing slovenly behavior. That is, we have been making the cost of illegitimacy or having kids out of wedlock relatively cheap.
You'd say that the government has exacerbated the plight of these poor blacks?
Yes.
How?
A number of ways. One, they've made it difficult to get jobs, to get started in the job market. Minimum wage law would be one of those things, but only one. The terrible schooling would be a major factor. That if you're going to turn out kids who are 40% functionally illiterate upon graduation from high school, then you're going to have very serious problems in the job market.
And the government is responsible for that?
The government runs the schools. Yes. State as well as federal. They're doing many things to make it much tougher for the person at the bottom to get started. And they're also making it less necessary to get started by having various subsidy programs, food stamps, welfare, and so on, which reduce the difference between working and not working. So that the general tendency of what they're doing is to make it harder to rise.
When you look at programs, you should ignore their intentions and ask, what is the effect? And I think that the effect of welfare has been devastating for black Americans.
Do you have to do you have to unravel the Great Society programs in order to permit ordinary human flourishing to begin taking place again?
Those programs that have in place perverse incentives, yes, you do need to get rid of them. You can't replace a father in the home with a check. It just doesn't work. The government's not very good at raising children. or being husbands. They're not very good at it. So yes, the right incentives do need to be in place.
Two things. Number one, you've got to be able to identify who they are amongst us that absolutely cannot help themselves. They have no one, they have no resources. That's actually one reason we should not have the government in this business. They can't identify. This is only done on a very local and personal level. Number two, once we've identified them, how do we help? How do we really help those that cannot help themselves? Well, you empower their charities. Local charities need empowerment. How do you do that? Does the government redistribute $700 billion, or do you allow free people to freely give to the charity they most want to?
When you think about it, I mean, centuries of slavery and generations of Jim Crow did not destroy the black family, but one generation of the welfare state did.
What we've done, in my opinion, is we've economically incentivized women to marry the government, and we've allowed men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility. And now we have this.
What we have in our country is poverty of the spirit. That is where people have become dependent on government programs, and they're not self-sufficient. That's the kind of poverty that we have today.
Why is it that we still have this prevailing social vision that seems not only not to ask what are the results, are our fine intentions actually achieving the ends we wish for, but almost refuses to look at the massive evidence to the contrary?
It was counterproductive.
So what's going on?
Partly what's going on among professional politicians is that it can be the end of a whole career to admit that you were wrong. Imagine you're president and you send men into battle in a war and they get wiped out and you say, you know, we really didn't have to fight that war. That is not something you're going to say. It's something you're not likely to say to yourself. There'll be 1,000 rationalizations, and the ability of the human mind to rationalize is just phenomenal.
I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream.
We have made some very significant strides. There's no doubt about the fact that we've come a long, long way since the days of slavery and since the days of rigid segregation. And one of the things that we can joyously point out is that legal segregation is dead today.
There was no debate in America about whether or not there was racial discrimination. Everybody knew there was. The question was what we were going to do about it. I think of 1964 and the Civil Rights Bill as the point at which America capitulated and apologized. We were wrong. Here's a huge piece of legislation affirming our commitment to not do this anymore. As a historical gesture, it was one of the great moral acknowledgments of any society ever. It was a really remarkable event.
The civil rights struggle is over and won in the United States, which doesn't mean that that all the problems have come to an end, but what it does mean is that they're not civil rights problems.
If you're a progressive, if you're a liberal, you want to keep race front and center in our national debates. Whether it's relevant to the discussion or not, you want to keep it front and center because you think it works for you politically.
The goal is to tell black people that we're victims, that discrimination and racism remain major problems in America when in fact they don't. And they want black people to vote for the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party gets 95% of the black vote, and the reason they get it is because blacks are convinced that the number one issue facing the country right now is social justice, racist white cops, discrimination, systemic racism, microaggression, whatever new word they come up with, and it's a bunch of nonsense. The number one problem domestically facing this country is a breakdown of the family. And President Obama said it, I didn't.
The intellectuals have told them that the world is unjust, that other people are keeping them down, that the fact that they don't have what other people have is somebody else's fault.
We need to face ourselves more frankly. You guys, as 75% of all black children born out of wedlock.
Where's the evidence of a lack of social justice? When a black suspect is killed by a cop, believe me, the media's on it, people are watching it.
If racism were the pervasive challenge facing the country, why are poor blacks failing in systems run by their own people?
In Baltimore, where Freddie Gray was killed, Freddie Gray died in a van, I shouldn't say was killed, died in a van.
Yeah.
You have a city that's 45% black. City council is 100% Democrat. The majority of city council is black. The top cop at the time was black. The number 2 cop was black. The majority of the command staff is black. The mayor is black. The AG is black. And yet here we are talking about racism.
There are no important forces in American life advocating for racism. You need to, and as blacks, we need to ask ourselves why we have become so dependent on this delusion that we live in a society that is intent on keeping us down. That's over with. It isn't that kind of, it's just over with.
Racism is the all-purpose explanation for what ails black America. There are a lot of people making a lot of money on that narrative, and they want to keep it out there.
Politics, like everything else, has some things it can do and some things it can't do. And from what I've seen of groups around the world economically, one of the things it seems not to be able to do is raise groups from poverty to affluence. People have discriminated against other people wherever they've had the power to do it, almost everywhere in the world and almost every period of history. Some groups are kept back by this, and some groups, it seems to make no difference whatever. The fact that people didn't hire Jews in the 19th century didn't stop Jews from hiring each other and setting up and dominating industries such as the garment industry or the beginning of the great Hollywood movie studios and other areas of the economy. It is the skills that are crucial and not the fact that other people are willing or unwilling to hire you.
There is a access of indoctrination. You have the media, you have academia, and you have Hollywood, all of which tell black people that they're victims. Most professors are to the left. The media certainly is all to the left, and Hollywood's to the left. And so you get up and you're indoctrinated all the time with things like social justice, inequality, the man's out to get you, we need a higher minimum wage. You name the left-wing policy, and you pick it up through osmosis.
Liberals have no interest in a post-racial society. They may claim that they long for one, but when you want racially gerrymandered voting districts, you don't want a post-racial society. When you want racial preferences in higher education, you don't want a post-racial society. When you name your group Black Lives Matter, you are not practicing post-racialism.
Making it a bigger issue than it needs to be is the problem we have. If you're born in the U.S., it really doesn't matter the condition of your birth. What matters is what you inherit from your nurturing, from your environment, whether or not you're going, I'm just from the standpoint of having been born with little. You here, you can always get out of that.
Where are we in the United States of America in race relations and what you see from day to day in your life?
Skip, they wouldn't want to ask me that. They wouldn't want my answer to represent it because God knows I have been nothing but blessed. My whole path, these 33 years have been nothing but a blessing. I have never, never is a strong word, I've never dealt with racism, and I'm glad I didn't have to. And I don't know if it's because of my blessings, I don't know if it's, but it is my reality. So I would have to say, not only did I thought it was over, I still believe it's over, but obviously it isn't.
So you've never experienced any offensive behavior from any other color or?
No, sir.
Wow.
The people who look at somebody like you and me and they say because your skin is a certain color, you have to think a certain way, and if you don't, there's something wrong with you, and they start calling you names, those are the real racists.
I am the antithesis of everything they stand for. A black guy who does not believe that he's a victim, a black guy who believes in hard work and personal responsibility, a black guy who doesn't believe in handouts, a black guy who doesn't believe in the welfare state, a black guy who doesn't believe in affirmative action. I can't just be dealt with facts and rebutted with facts. I've got to be maligned. I've got to be a token, bootlicker, Uncle Tom.
I don't want a Black History Month. Black history is American history.
How are we going to get rid of racism?
Stop talking about it. I'm going to stop calling you a white man.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask you to stop calling me a black man.
Well, if racism is so virulent, it ought to be obvious. When I was a kid, it was obvious. No one denied it. It was visible to everybody every day. And that was the beginning and the end of it. Today, where is it? Where are you being stopped? Well, I want to rise. I want to be a politician. I want to be the president. Okay.
I think a lot of white Americans thought that voting for a black president would get this country over a hump. And they reelected him because they weren't done congratulating themselves for electing the first black president. What?
Oh, wait, but you just said something that's profound. It's witty, but that's in other words, to many white voters, the election and then the re-election was about white people. It was about themselves.
Right, and what Obama symbolized. Obama was a symbol. You weren't voting for the man himself necessarily. And again, I hesitate to paint with too broad a brush here, but I think many white Americans saw him as a symbol of progress, and thought we could achieve some sort of post-racial America.
You can't legislate love. You can change laws, but you can't legislate people into loving you. It takes time, and it depends upon what's going on in their home. You can change the law, but if you go home and teach your son how to hate every day, doesn't matter what law has been changed. Until you teach your son how to love, then the law is not going to change the way your son feels.
A lot of white kids love rap.
Yes.
Explain that. What does that say to you? What's the message of it? What's the bigger picture of it?
I don't want to be bashed because I don't want to sound like I'm on the wrong if there is a side, but I thought that was clearly a message that there was no such thing as racism. That's what I thought.
Race plays a part in wealth distribution, or either a mindset that you can
Today?
or cannot. Yeah.
No. You don't? No, I don't. You and I, no proof. Why would race have anything to do with it? Put your mind to what you want to do and go for that. It's kind of like religion to me. It's a good excuse for not getting there.
I look at people, I don't see colors. I don't judge people by colors. I say that, well, gee, you're a man just like I am, and whatever you are after that. That's what my stepfather used to say. He says every man stands up to piss, and he's whatever he is after that.
Where were you born?
Me?
Yeah.
Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Baton Rouge General Hospital.
I was born in Memphis, Tennessee. I had a long haul from where I came from to here, but here we are.
Right.
So proof is in the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and here we sit at the dining table.
But it's hard to, when you say that to some people, because they say, oh, there you go with a pull yourself up by the bootstraps thing, and you know, you're just being respectable. Not everybody can do that.
Well, everybody can.
What's your thought on Black Lives Matter?
What is it? What do you mean?
The idea is that there's this movement called Black Lives Matter, thinking that the rest of America didn't seem to understand that Black Lives Matter.
I am a young, black, rich If that don't let you know that America understands Black matter these days, I don't know what it is. Don't come at me with that dumb man.
The kind of crime that we see in many black neighborhoods is entirely new. I grew up in the Richdown Housing Project in North Philadelphia, and we didn't go to bed to the sounds of gunshots. And many people, they did not lock their door until 11 o'clock or 10 o'clock at night when everybody was home.
When I grew up in Harlem in the 40s and 50s, I never heard a gunshot. There were old men who you could see sit on a hot summer night, sitting outdoors into the wee hours playing cards or checkers or whatever. It was a different world. Most black kids, even under slavery, had lived with two parents. And that was true all the way up until the 1960s.
In 1880s, the 75% of black kids lived in two-parent families.
After the civil rights victories in the sort of late 60s, where black people began to create this identity that we called blackness, it was angry, and it was resentful, and it was separatist. There was the illusion in it somehow that we would get farther as a separate, unified people than we would by joining America and becoming regular citizens.
There was a period, I'm trying to remember now, I believe it was in the mid-70s, when substandard English began to become viewed as a discipline of its own within linguistic studies and so forth. And for all I know, it was all perfectly legitimate that certain speech patterns would be traced back to various regions in Africa and so forth. And this is a language of its own. It has its own validity.
None of these things went back to Africa. For example, using the word axe for ask and stuff like that. All of that goes back to the South. And it goes back to the parts of Britain from which white Southerners came. So if you trace, calling hog entrails chitlins, that was in a certain section of Britain, the section from which whites moved into the South. And they were known as rednecks and crackers in Britain in centuries past, before they ever set foot in the South. That very same subculture held whites in the South back as well. That in the time this mental testing in the First World War turned up, among other things, the fact that whites from various 4 or 5 southern states scored lower on the mental test than blacks from 4 or 5 northern states. And so it really was a question of the subculture that was there, which was a handicap to both. If you look at what actually happens in the wake of these wonderful sounding policies, you see disaster after disaster.
Often out of humanitarian concern, fathers have left home in order for their children to get meat and bread.
Children raised without two parents present. That was about 22% in 1960. One generation later, it was 67%. And it's gone up a little since then as well.
No, so the last time I went to the welfare, the lady told me, said if you have a living husband, that they couldn't give you no help.
Why did black Americans prove susceptible to that change first?
Because they were poor. I don't think that many Asian American girls who are preparing to go off to Stanford or Harvard are going to say, hey, I can live on welfare, why should I abstain?
Now, I'm not into a sexual bag when you're supposed to start having sex, but I know that if you are born and you find out that your mother is 14 and your grandmother is 30 and you don't know who or where your father is, that is a hell of a start on life. I mean, you're doomed to repeat that cycle. Now, if you say that racism is the cause of that, well, then you'd have to explain why was black illegitimacy 12% in 1940, or why was black teenage pregnancy in 1918 less than white teenage pregnancy in 1918. And surely it was much more racial discrimination back then than there is now.
Ways of holding blacks in slavery at low cost was to keep the people dependent as much as possible. It's ironic that that same principle comes up in the welfare state 100 years later.
If you have been an oppressed people, and we were obviously truly oppressed for centuries, we learned all sorts of things in order to survive that. I won't go into a long list, but we learned how to reinvent ourselves. We learned how to live with this oppression, with this sort of negative force in your life. We created a great music out of this. We did other things that had a worldwide impact. We expanded the idea of democracy and made freedom an absolute. We did all those things. The one thing we never had a chance to do, was to live in freedom.
Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside.
Historically, it scared the hell out of us. We would be fantasizing if we denied that. Who wouldn't be? Freedom is a frightening thing. It places such a burden of responsibility on you, on the person who has it. You're now responsible. Your reputation is based now on what you do.
You cite 6 groups in 2 categories. You cite Jews, Chinese, and Japanese as overachieving groups. You cite blacks, Puerto Ricans, and Mexicans as underachieving groups. Now, what are you describing there? What have you identified there as a variable?
Income. Well, the achievement is measured in terms of income and occupation. That is economic achievement. Obviously, there are other kinds of things that make up life. But, and I wouldn't want to stigmatize groups as permanently underachievers. If you look at generation by generation, you find incredible changes. The black population especially. The change in occupations of blacks between the 1920s and the 1950s is just phenomenal. So that what we're watching are people who, for cultural reasons and historical reasons, begin behind a certain level and have not closed the gap. It's like a relay race. You don't say that the runner is a bad runner because he hasn't closed the gap when he started 50 yards behind. If he's 40 yards behind now, we don't call him a failure. We say he's made up 10 yards. Blacks started much further behind. I don't think people realize how much further behind blacks started and how much progress has been made. There's a distinguished economic historian, Robert Higgs, who has said that for blacks to go from being completely illiterate in the middle of the 19th century to being 1/2 literate and by 1900 is just an amazing achievement in the history of the world. But you very seldom find that kind of change that quickly. So it depends on what you're holding as your standard.
Standard is that blacks haven't caught up with whites.
But whites haven't stood still.
You quote in Intellectuals and Race the famous black writer James Baldwin. He's writing in 1960, quote, "People in Harlem know they are living there because white people do not think they are good enough to live anywhere else. In a new housing project in Harlem, they naturally began smashing windows, defacing walls, and, you'll forgive me, but this is his language, urinating in the elevators." Close quote. What's wrong with his thinking?
Oh my gosh, you need a couple of hours. But it so happens I grew up in Harlem in the 1940s, 1950s, and you didn't expect to find people urinating in places where black people live. In fact, there's very little attention given to the fact that the public housing of that era was radically different from the public housing of today. I remember we had a relative of ours got into some public housing. We were so proud because you had to have a certain character, a record, and so forth to get in. These were not places where you had dumping grounds for people who were at the bottom of the pile.
In Intellectuals and Race, you cite an observation by the intelligence expert, IQ scientist James Flynn, that just stopped me cold. After the Second World War, you've got large numbers of American troops remaining in Germany. For that matter, there's still several tens of thousands there today. And both black and white American soldiers had children with German women. And Flynn discovered that those children growing up in Germany showed no IQ differences at all. The black kids and the white kids, the same. Quoting intellectuals and race, Professor Flynn concluded that the reason was that the offspring of black soldiers in Germany, and now you're quoting Professor Flynn, grew up in a nation with no black subculture, close quote. Which means what? Which means they experienced exactly the same expectations. Is this
No, the expectations are external. The culture in which they grew up was not the culture in which black kids grew up in America today.
So they had...
There's no gangster rap.
You say the Chinese succeed because they outwork everyone else.
Oh, yes.
Is it that simple?
In a sense, yes. That if you put in enormous amounts of work, you're going to have a tremendous advantage over people who don't. A study was done in San Francisco schools to show Asians, blacks, whites, Hispanics, and how they score in various fields and mathematics in particular. And there were vast differences, for example, between the Asians and blacks in terms of how many got high math grades. What struck me was that for both the Asians and the Africans, the number of hours that you spent working or doing homework in math was almost identical with the same percentage who got high grades in math. So that whether you're black or Chinese, if you spend an awful lot of time on the math, you're going to be doing better than the person who's not. And although there were great disparities, the disparities were differences in how much time you spent on math homework.
There are basically two narratives that people concerned about persisting racial inequality can adopt. The first is white America must reform itself. We need more of this or that, whatever the this or that is of the latter-day agenda of the race reformers. We need more of this or we need more of that. White America must reform itself. Racism must end. You see it in the New York Times every day. But the other narrative, which I take very seriously and for which I think there's a ton of evidence, I'm calling the development narrative. I'm saying that you have to look at the processes by which people come to acquire skills, traits, habits, orientations that lend themselves to successful participation in American society. The development narrative puts more onus on the responsibilities of African Americans to be engaged in the processes that lead to the development of full human potential, and points towards solving the actual problems rather than this kind of wishful argument. If we could double the budget for this program, then the homicide rate amongst young African American males would go down.
What do people do with freedom when they don't know how to handle it? They reinvent their oppression, even as it has faded away. They make it up in their mind all over again. Racism is around every corner. There is systemic racism. There's structural racism. There are microaggressions and there's white privilege. Rather than say, oh my goodness, we in fact, it is over. Our oppression is over with. We really are free people. We scream to high heavens that Steele is crazy, that it's laughable. Can't you see racism everywhere? White supremacy is just infused into literally the air of America. So that black people are, well, what is this longing for an identity, a black identity grounded in victimization, is a longing for an excuse to not accept the challenge of freedom. It is a way to escape that challenge.
When I look at the success of groups like Black Lives Matter and gaining the public's imagination, capturing the public's imagination, I'm very pessimistic about this. I believe that groups like that or that type of thinking is ascendant in the country right now. The whole social justice movement makes me very pessimistic.
Freedom it comes with a judgmentalism. It judges you. If you don't know how to thrive in freedom, it means that you are at fault. You are, and the worst word you can use regarding blacks, you are inferior. It's a chilling idea, but it's at the heart. It is the heart of the shock of freedom. Because freedom now is saying you can't use oppression as an excuse anymore. If you're not doing well, it's not because of oppression. For goodness sakes, we've got affirmative action. We've got everything to help you. If you're not doing well now, it's on you.
Whose job is it to say, wrong subculture, folks, you're harming yourselves?
Well, I would think in an ideal world that intellectuals might take on that task, but the world that we live in, I've noticed, is not ideal. Slavery has been a universal institution for thousands of years, as far back as you can trace human history. And what we're looking at is if slavery is something that happened to one race of people in one country, when in fact the spread of it was around the world. In 1776, which is when Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, as well as when the United States got started, he said that Western Europe is the only place in the world where there is no slavery. The Europeans enslaved Slavs for centuries before they brought the first black African to the Western Hemisphere.
Caucasians enslaved Caucasians, Africans enslaved Africans, Asians enslaved Asians, Native Americans enslaved Native Americans. We go on and on and on.
Racial difference between the slaves and the enslavers, that is a relatively new phenomenon. You didn't have in ancient times the ability to go to another continent and move millions of people of a different race across the ocean. So you enslaved the people who were nearby.
What about the role that Africa played in the slave trade? Without the capture and enslavement of blacks and the selling of these slaves by black chieftains, African chieftains, the slave trade never could have occurred.
The number of whites, for example, who were enslaved in North Africa by the Barbary pirates exceeded the number of Africans enslaved in the United States and in the American colonies before that, put together.
The analogy with which John McWhorter and others like Andrew Sullivan have made to religion and Christianity in particular is useful, because you have this notion of original sin. It's a sin that can never be totally redeemed. Everyone is born with it, and white guilt is kind of analogous to that, because you can't get rid of being, once you're white your whole life, barring any transracial surgery. You just are white, and you have that moral stain upon you.
White guilt is the terror of being seen as a racist, as a bigot, that now pervades American life. All of our social policy, our culture, everything is touched by this anxiety in most of white America, understandably, given America's history, that they're vulnerable. They have this vulnerability to being disarmed of moral authority by being called a racist.
I think broadly there are two kinds of history. There's a secular history, which is you go to your class or you read a history book about World War I, you learn all the facts, learn the opposing perspectives, and then when you're done with it, you're done with it. Then there's a religious way of looking at history where it's not enough to learn it. You have to repeat it over and over and over. And I think black history in this country, it's almost squarely in the religious history category at this point. So yeah, I mean that is connected to white guilt and original sin, and yeah.
Whether it's an NAACP who wants to stay relevant, or a Barack Obama who wants to get elected, they have a very selective view of which histories they're going to discuss. But you need honest thinkers out there giving people the full scope of black history, which is more than a history of what whites have done to blacks. That's not the sum of black history in this country, but you might think it is listening to some on the left discuss our past.
But for the West's revulsion ultimately against slavery, we might still have it.
There has to be, right now we have an identity as blacks that's victim focused. We're victims, which basically is designed to tap into white guilt and get them to give us all kinds of little, basically crumbs. And we're just sort of locked into that.
renaming Calhoun College at Yale, taking down Confederate monuments, removing statues of Robert E. Lee.
On the list of things that should be concerning the black leadership, these would be at the bottom, at the very bottom. I just, that is not what low-income blacks need.
Who would have thought in the year 2019, just what, a few years after the departure of the first black president, who got elected in 2008, re-elected in 2012 despite a tepid recovery and unpopular Obamacare? Who would have thought we'd be having a serious discussion, at least on the left, of reparations? Who would have thought that? Are you kidding me? You've got to be kidding. Reparations. There are a few problems. There are no living slaves. There are no living slave owners. That's the biggest problem. Reparations is a scheme to extract money from people who were never slave owners and give it to people who were never slaves.
I can't get over the idea of A, apologizing for what B did.
Only about 5% of whites have any sort of generational connection to slavery. So the other 95% who had nothing to do with it also pay? What about all the people who came over to the country after slavery was over? What about Kamala Harris? Kamala Harris's mother is from India. Her father is from Jamaica. Her father concedes that he and his family owned slaves. How does that work? What about Barack Obama? Barack Obama's father is from Kenya. There's no evidence that his family directly owned slaves, but what is now Kenya was directly involved, intimately involved in the slave trade. And his mother, there's no question that her family owned slaves on his mom's side. So how does that work? Does Obama pay more than other blacks for reparations? What about all the people who are working class and middle class who are black? The premise behind reparations apparently is, but for slavery, but for Jim Crow, you wouldn't have the kind of poverty that you have in the black community. Blacks are about 20% poor. Whites are about 8.7% poor. How did white people get poor? Given the white privilege that they were supposed to benefit by, the trust fund that every white person gets. So are the white people who are poor exempted from having to pay any of the reparations? What about the fact that my colleague in Salem, Michael Medved, once said, only about 5% of whites have any sort of generational connection to slavery. So the other 95% who had nothing to do with it also pay? What about all the people who came over to the country after slavery was over? It's insane.
What we see in the United States, in terms of the bad things, you see all around the world. If you were to give reparations to everyone whose ancestors had been slaves, I suspect that you would have to give reparations to more than half the entire population of the globe. Slavery was not confined to one set of races. I suspect that most of the people who were either slaves or slave owners around the world were neither white nor black. I mean, this was a universal curse of the human species.
It's because the groups like Black Lives Matter now control the narrative of what drives inequality in this country. And when you control the narrative, it's as if the facts don't really matter.
White guilt is black power.
So anecdotes replace data, empirical evidence, logic, reasoning. On social media, a video goes viral, and so this is representative of what is going on in the country because CNN plays it in loop over and over again, and other networks pick it up. They control the narrative, and it's unfortunate, but that's where we are today.
How is it that assimilating my protest to a expression of contempt for national symbols, how's that effective? Why am I making that the site of my protest? You know, I have a right to protest. Of course you have a right to protest, but it could be a really stupid thing to do. You just gratuitously alienated 30 or 40% of the people whose support you need. The cops are killing more white people than black people in this country on a daily basis. I thought you actually wanted to change it. Or this guy, Ta-Nehisi Coates, used to write for The Atlantic. He makes a big case about the case for reparations. They want reparations for slavery. They're not talking to the World Court. They're not talking to the United Nations. They're talking to the American people. If there were ever going to be anything in the direction of reparations, it would have to be agreed upon as a national project by Americans. So how is it that out of one side of your mouth you can say, America owes black people reparations. And on the other side of your mouth, you can say, in effect, America is a gangster nation full of hooded supremacists for whom we have nothing but contempt. You're not really interested in politics, are you? You're interested in performance. You're grandstanding. You're pouting.
The best response to reparations, to the reparations argument that I've ever come across came from Shelby Steele, where he said that slavery can be endured and overcome. It cannot be repaid.
We have a whole generation of black leaders who do one thing and one thing only: milk white guilt.
I think that it's very problematic that the truth statement, the slogan that Black Lives Matter, in the same way that all lives matter, that because the slogan Black Lives Matter is a truth statement, people that want to help blacks and they're white, they're being shamed, they feel like the only way they can show support is to donate money or to acquiesce or get down on their knees before black people. And that's not going to benefit the black community.
It goes back to that basic principle. There are profiteers. The current profiteer is Black Lives. How can these corporations give millions of dollars to Black Lives? What is the organizational structure? What are they doing with the money? Are they building up the community with it? Corporations, stop giving money. Al Sharpton wants the African American community to believe that the government and the boogeyman and the white guy are all against him. Why, Mark? So that he can be a profiteer.
It's absolutely about power. And if you go to the Black Lives Matter website and you click on the link to donate, that money is going to Democratic candidates.
Would you close our program by reading a passage from your marvelous new book, Discrimination and Disparities?
It's about people who want to redress the past. The only times over which we have any degree of influence at all are the present and the future, both of which can be made worse by attempts at symbolic restitution among the living for what happened among the dead, who are far beyond our power to help or punish or avenge. Any serious consideration of the world as it is today, around us today, must tell us that maintaining common decency, much less peace and harmony, among living contemporaries is a major challenge, both among nations and within nations. To admit that we can do nothing about what happened among the dead is not to give up the struggle for a better world, but to concentrate our efforts where they have at least some hope of making things better for the living.
Dr. Thomas Sowell, author of Discrimination and Disparities, thank you.
Thank you.
The public opinion polls that I've seen, majorities of blacks and Hispanics want school choice.
It's hugely popular among the very people who want it and need it most. Low income, inner city, black and Hispanic people. For decades, it has pulled off the charts.
73% of Baltimoreans say they have no confidence in their school system. There are 13 high schools in Baltimore where 0% of kids are proficient in math.
And in 6 other Baltimore schools, only 1% tested proficient in math. Now, some people say, well, gee, the problem is finances. Well, it turns out that's just plain nonsense. That is, of the 100 largest school districts in the country, Baltimore ranks 4th in terms of spending on students. Part of the tragedy of this is that these kids are incompetent in math and incompetent in English, but they receive their high school graduation diplomas. Last June, for example, just one school in Baltimore where 90% of the students scored the lowest possible score one can get on the math exam, they held graduation exercises. And the families were proud of their sons and daughters, and some of them even won scholarships to colleges. Now, the social tragedy involved in fraudulent diplomas is that these black students, as well as their families, they think that their kid has a high school diploma just like the white kid has a high school diploma. And so if these kids can't get good jobs, they can't pass a civil service exam, they flunk out of college, Well, the tendency is to attribute it to racism.
There was a school just 2 blocks up the street in which only 2 children in the entire 8th grade could do math on grade level. In that school that we were running, 96% of the children could read on grade level, and 84% could do math on grade level. The reason why 1,194 children applied to just one of my schools in 1 year without printing a single brochure, without going to a single church to talk about it, is because they got tired. And isn't that a revelatory experience when black people get tired? And what they're tired of is saying, I just want my son to go to a school where I know at the end of the day he's gonna come home one day better prepared.
A few years ago, on the statewide, New York statewide math tests, there was an elementary school, grade 4, I believe, in Harlem, whose students passed those tests at a higher rate than any 4th grade kids anywhere in the state of New York. I mean, we're talking Scarsdale, Briarcliff, places like that. The Success Academy schools as a whole, their students pass both the math and the English statewide tests at a higher rate than any school district in the entire state of New York. And these are not kids who are skimming the cream. They're kids chosen by lottery. They don't even test them for ability. They don't even look at their academic record. They take them into the schools and they have hard work, and they make it clear at the outset, and they don't tolerate a lot of nonsensical behavior. And these kids are doing incredibly. And yet the mayor of New York is doing his darndest to put a stop to the expansion of schools in general, but his special ire is aimed at the Success Academy schools. And this is happening all over the country.
Because they make the teachers' unions look bad that run the public schools? What's the political motivation? Why would Mayor de Blasio have an out for the charter schools, such as Success Academy?
Well, the teachers' union are the major reason. We're talking about the money they contribute, the number of votes they contribute.
Charter school kids in the same building with traditional public school kids pass the math test nearly 7 times as often. That's an average. At the extremes, it's almost unbelievable. I mean, one classic example is a school where 7% of the kids in the traditional public school in that building pass the math test. In the charter school, 100% pass the math test.
This whole debate we have about school choice is not really about whether school choice works. It's about whether public education should be primarily a jobs program for adults.
There's all kind of chicanery to prevent the charter schools from expanding. That's why you have tens of thousands on the waiting list. It's not that the charter schools aren't willing to expand, but every conceivable obstacle is put in their way.
Well, they understand that if 50,000 kids on waiting lists to get into charter schools are able to do so, and the per pupil allotment of money is $20,000, more than $20,000 per student, that means that the traditional public school will lose more than $1 billion a year. And the public schools are in no mood to lose that kind of money. And the teachers' unions are by no means in a mood to lose that many teachers' jobs and the union dues that those teachers pay.
One of the things they're doing is imposing the same kinds of restrictions on the charter schools that made the public schools so bad. For example, restrictions on being able to get rid of kids who are running amok and ruining the education of everybody else. And the charter schools don't tolerate that. The things that are tolerated in the public schools are unbelievable.
In those inner city schools, they're crime ridden. Students are afraid to go to school because of the quote, restorative justice rooted in Marxism, and it is making it almost impossible for students to be suspended. And in cities that are run by Democrats, they have not gotten rid of that. And so there's lawlessness within the schoolhouse. The teachers are afraid to teach. There's chaos in school, just like it is on the streets. And I think that that's very problematic, and we need school choice. We need to hold public schools accountable. And whenever Democratic cities want money, they say we have to pay our teachers more. They use the teachers, but a lot of that money never reaches the teachers. It's used for administrative purposes.
The interests of the teachers' unions can be opposite to those of the teachers. For example, if there's a large increase of money into the school system, and they're always saying it's underfunded, no matter how many billions of dollars go down a bottomless pit. When the money is out there and available, you could use that money to raise teachers' salaries. That would be good for the teachers. It would be bad for the teachers' unions. The teachers' unions get more dues if instead of raising the teachers' salaries, you create more jobs, more teachers' aides, more counselors, more nurses, more this, more that, more bureaucrats in the system, because all those people will be paying union dues.
Now we have another court decision going up regarding schools, whether money should be able to follow children to schools parents want. And that answer should be yes. But because of unions, the answer is no. Because of the Blaine Amendment, the answer is no. So now a case is going to the court, which will revolutionize education in our poor communities if the court decides that it's not unconstitutional for money to follow children to schools parents want, including if the parents want a religious school.
Your Jesse Jacksons, your Al Sharptons, your NAACPs tend to oppose school choice because they are siding with the unions, who do not like it, not because it doesn't work, but because many of these charter schools and many of these schools where the vouchers would be used aren't organized. And their primary concern are the adults in the system, not the kids.
There is a whole way of life that has come about in the traditional public schools. There's no way that they can compete with the charter schools without changing that profoundly. For example, the ironclad job protection that the teachers have, so that teachers who have done all kinds of terrible things remain on the payroll because it is just too expensive to get rid of them. My gosh, they have one class of teachers who did no teaching at all and would just report to some vacant room and sit there during the day, and they would collect full pay and collect seniority and their various benefits and so forth, because the cost of firing them is prohibitive. It's prohibitive in financial terms and in time. If you want, in money terms, a study has shown that to fire a teacher for incompetence, it takes an average of 830 days, which is more than 2 years, and costs an average of $313,000. And that by no means guarantees that you'll be able to do it.
Hiring teachers after 2 years in the classroom, giving them a job for life, making them impossible to fire, there's no educational justification for that. Those are job protections.
Do you know that nationwide, only about 10% of American families send their kids to private schools? 6% of American black families do. However, in Chicago, of the teachers with school-age kids, 39% send them to private schools. Now that's the equivalent of opening up a restaurant, holding up a sign saying, open for business, but don't eat the food.
There is no more powerful declaration of our own humanity as black people, even for light-skinned ones with curly hair, than to stand on our own 2 feet and say we are not going to send our children to schools that we know will not educate them. You cannot call it a school if children don't learn.
There's only one solution to this problem. That is, we need more school choice. We need to break the education monopoly and give parents more choice. That is, there are a number of parents who want their kids to get a good education and they're willing to sacrifice, and the kids themselves, they want a good education. But however, if they're in a rotten school, they will not get a good education. So the solution for many black children, and as white children as well, is for us to have school choice.
Democrats around the country are lining up to stop charter schools from expanding, try to cut back on them, and many of them are the very schools that are most successful, are the ones they're zeroing in. Places like Success Academy or KIPP schools and so forth.
Obama becomes president of the United States and spends 8 years trying to shut down a school voucher program in his own backyard in Washington, D.C. that was started by his predecessor, George W. Bush. Why? Why the first black president could enhance this program that he knows, poll after poll shows, is popular in the black community? The reason is that Barack Obama is no longer simply another black person. He's now a black president. He has special interests that are nipping at his heels. He wants to be reelected. He has to indulge these special interests, one of whom are teachers' unions, who oppose school choice because many of these schools aren't unionized and don't use union labor. So Obama has a choice. Am I going to side with my political benefactors, or am I going to side with this black constituency that helped put me in office? He made his choice. He sided with the teachers' unions. And that's what you're going to see because politicians want to get reelected. And when their interests part ways with those of the people they claim to represent, they're gonna put their own interests first, because that's what politicians do. And that is the problem for low-income blacks looking to politicians.
They want their constituents, their constituents to believe that the Democratic Party and the government has to do everything. It's the only way they can stay in power. They don't want charter school. They don't want choice. They don't want people of color to think for themselves, to work and make their own career choice. They want the government to hand out things. They want their constituents to believe that the government is everything for them.
The Democrats, I understand they have to do that because they're beholden to the teachers' unions. But why the Republicans don't say anything about it, that is what baffles me.
What we want are for blacks to be in a position to thrive no matter who's in office.
Freedom is not enough. You do not wipe away the scars of centuries by saying now, you are free to go where you want and do as you desire and choose the leaders you please. You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bringing up to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe that you have been completely fair.
What Johnson was saying was, we oppressed you, now we're going to lift you up and redeem you. Your fate, you don't see your fate as being in your hands. It's now in our hands, the government's hands, every kind of philanthropic group's hand, everybody's hands but yours.
They want to keep the focus on what government or Washington or politicians or whites in general can do for blacks or should be doing for blacks, instead of what blacks can do for themselves.
There are various laws and policies that benefit one group at the expense of another. But I think affirmative action has the distinction of being one that it harms everybody, though in different ways. There are black kids who have all the qualifications to be successes in college, who nevertheless are failures because they are systematically mismatched with institutions whose standards they don't meet, even though they may meet the standards of 80 or 90% of the colleges in America.
And we saw that when California ended its ban on racial preferences back in 1996. What happened after that ban took place is that black graduation rates increased by more than 50%. Not only overall, but in some of the more difficult disciplines like math and science and engineering, again, by more than 50%. So a policy intended to help increase the number of black graduates was resulting in fewer doctors, fewer lawyers, fewer engineers than we otherwise would have had. Well, what happened is that these schools were funneling blacks into environments where they didn't match the educational credentials of the average student at the school.
Taking a person who scored 1800 on the SAT, a black person, black kid, and putting them, because of affirmative action, into a school where the average SAT score is 2100 is not necessarily good for them.
When I was teaching at Cornell, I found that half the black students at Cornell were on some kind of academic probation. And so I went over to the administration building and looked up the SATs of these students. The average black student at Cornell at that time scored at the 75th percentile.
Which is pretty darn good.
Yes. And so that means that in most colleges in this country, they would have no trouble, and many of them would be on the dean's list. But at Cornell, the average liberal arts student at that time was in the 99th percentile. And when you're teaching the students like that, you teach at a pace that most people of any race cannot keep up with.
The average black student at Berkeley is above the national average on test scores. It's just that the average white student is further above the national average, and the average Asian student further above than the white students. And so in that atmosphere, these students who have every qualification to succeed are artificially turned into failures.
And so they were outmatched, and many of them dropped out or switched to easier majors.
The only beneficiary of that is the University of California at Berkeley, because what they've effectively done is rented these bodies for window dressing for a few years. And then when they're through with them, they're put aside, and a new bunch of bodies are brought in.
There was a study in the 80s of black students at MIT that found that while they were in the top 5% of math scores in the whole nation, they were in the bottom 5% of math scores at MIT. This is a straightforward consequence of affirmative action.
So you have these very smart black kids who would be hitting it out of the park at a less selective school, but they're struggling at MIT. And MIT could care less.
Put yourself in the position of a black kid who comes out of a ghetto school, and he's gone through for 12 years with nothing but A's and B's without a great deal of effort. And now he finds himself for the first time in his life in a predominantly white environment. And he finds that when he works twice as hard as he's ever worked, all he gets back for his work is a D. And that there is also a minority establishment. This is true not only of blacks, but of minorities in general. Establishment which tells him, yes, this is the racism on this campus. That the white power structure is trying to keep you down. And it has to have a certain plausibility to it. It would have had a certain plausibility to me had I come along in that era.
Princeton sociologist Thomas Espenshade in 2009 found that the average Asian student had to score 450 points higher on the SAT than the average black student to have the same odds of getting into elite colleges. That's a massive gap.
Yeah, it
That's
really
a
is.
massive premium you're putting on being black and a massive penalty you're putting on happening to be born Asian.
The way the whole affirmative action debate has evolved, graduation rates aren't the priority. Diversity is the priority. The campus has to look like America. The college catalog has to be properly color-coded. Whether kids are actually graduating is a secondary concern at best.
You have the kid who goes to a top-level school. He wants to be a chemist or whatever. And now he gets there and he finds he cannot learn chemistry as it's taught at that school. It does not mean he can't learn chemistry. It means that if they have very high-pressure students, they can teach this stuff at a very fast rate, skipping on explanations, skipping over steps in the mathematics, and these students will all pick that up as they go along. He may find that he can't keep up with that. And so in order to survive, he switches into some easy subject, which may be some ethnic studies program or what have you. And so someone who could have gotten a first-rate education at a good college ends up getting a third-rate education at a top college, or ends up flunking out altogether. We have more than 3,000 colleges and universities in this country. Every human being that's not severely mentally retarded is perfectly qualified to be at one of those institutions. I mean, there are institutions where if you can fill out the application form, you're qualified to do the work. And there are others where if you're not in the top 1 or 2%, your chances of making it are extremely slim. And it's precisely these second places that they want to send black students, that they don't send white students of the same level of ability.
Affirmative action just basically says what's important about you is the color of your skin, the very thing that was important about us when we were oppressed. When do we get to be human beings? When do we get to be people who compete on their own merit? We now have to overcome the blemish, the diminishment that affirmative action imposed on us. You have to rationalize that, and by saying you're a victim. And we're back in the same game again. I'm a victim, and so therefore I deserve this. And I don't have to become competitive. And so affirmative action is the sort of archetypal re-oppression of people. That is an oppressive system that you've inflicted on black Americans so that you can get an optic that shows you to be innocent of racism, even as you are practicing. Yeah.
In 2004, Henry Louis Gates and Lonnie Guinier, two black professors at Harvard, did a study of Harvard's black students and found that 2/3 of them were either immigrants, the children of immigrants, or to a lesser extent, biracial. When that cohort makes up like 10% of America's black people. So 10% of black Americans were making up like 2/3 of black Harvard students. So that the reason that there's been no data
after that they stopped releasing data.
I have not seen a single data point on West Indians in the Ivy League since 2004, because it is, I guess it's politically inconvenient on multiple fronts. One being that it certainly deflates the logic of systemic racism again, because if it's that, why are West Indians doing so well? Mm-hmm. If systemic racism is such a big problem. And the second way it's deflationary is that the supposed boon of affirmative action is being felt more by immigrants than by the people it was intended to help, which was the descendants of American slaves.
Right.
It's patronization. It's African Americans embracing and the establishment adopting a set of practices that basically are rooted in the soft bigotry of low expectations.
My favorite sports league, the NBA, the National Basketball Association, is more than 65% black. And I don't think any serious person would believe that that's because white jocks just don't get a fair shake in American society. The reason is that there's what you might call a cultural variable. African Americans play basketball more, and so on average, at the median, with all due respect to the hick from French Lick, we're better at it. White guys play more baseball, and if you look at MLB, that is a very heavily Caucasian and Hispanic athletic league. And you see this same thing in more what you might call serious situations all the time.
There simply has not been the pattern of entrepreneurship in the black population. That's been true of other groups such as the Irish, for example. The Irish are doing quite well today, but they're not doing well in entrepreneurial occupations. They're in the law, they're in the church, they're in this, they're in that. And on the bottom line is they're doing better than the average American, but they're not doing it in those particular fields. Every group succeeds in some particular area. Blacks who win Nobel Prizes don't win them in the same fields that the Chinese win Nobel Prizes in.
In 1995, the government economist June O'Neill, who's a liberal as I understand, and the conservative researcher Dinesh D'Souza, who was fairly nonpartisan at the time, looked at the troubling fact that there is a gap between black and white incomes. As I recall, African Americans made 82% of what Caucasians did. And this was just universally attributed to racism. And what they found out was that that wasn't the case. There were a lot of quote-unquote variables involved. African Americans are a younger population. The most common age for a black man is 27. The most common age for a white man is 58. Obviously, people earn more later in life when they've had the chance to move into executive roles. African Americans are much more concentrated in the South, where wages are lower for everyone. If you adjust for these factors and just a couple of others, I mean years, not even quality of schooling, just staying in school, average performance on a test like the SAT, the gap almost disappeared.
When it comes to the incentives that are created, the businessman is going to try to protect himself whatever way he can, and that means hiring those blacks who are overqualified, who have a long track record and so on. And that's what all the data show, that the more, for example, black couples where the husband and wife are both college educated now make more money than white couples where the husband and wife are both educated. But the black female-headed family has lost real income in absolute terms over the past several years and has fallen further behind white female-headed families. So the very opposite trends are going on at the same time, and you can't argue this because of blackness or racism, because both of them are black people. One group is shooting way ahead, one is falling further and further behind. And a large part of that reason, I believe, and the data seem to suggest, is because the incentives created by affirmative action and similar kinds of programs just make it too dangerous to take a chance.
I find affirmative action as a term to be so misleading because it is a policy of racial discrimination straightforwardly. It is taking someone's skin color into account and judging them by a different standard, treating them differently on that basis. Straightforward example of a racially discriminatory policy, and would be recognized as such to someone with someone not from our culture would see that and think, oh, that's what the definition of racial discrimination is. So the question with affirmative action is, what are we getting that is so valuable that it's worth discriminating based on race?
If the Ku Klux Klan had invented a social policy to keep black people down, they could not have done a better job than affirmative action.
The colleges themselves try to say that they're victims of the racism of the larger society. And in point of fact, the racism on the campuses is greater than that in the larger society, in many campuses. And what I worry about is that they're going to graduate into the general society, blacks and whites alike, who hate each other's guts, and who can be the leaders of new racial strife for the future.